buildings are among the major construction, and buildings are among the major sectors as far as contributing to total emissions are concerned. So here are a few ideas. This is from Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction, the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. Beyond foundations, mainstreaming sustainable solutions to cut emissions from the buildings sector. Obviously a good idea, and you have to take the ideas from wherever they come from. Just because they are profit-making companies doesn't mean they cannot put out good ideas on what they want to do to make themselves more sustainable, because everybody now has a motivation to at least appear to be environmentally friendly and sustainable. And of course there are green certification programs and so on. The executive summary is that the buildings and construction sector contributes significantly to global climate change, accounting for about 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In 2022, buildings were responsible for 34% of global energy demand and 37% of energy and process-related carbon dioxide emissions. This is only expected to keep growing by 2050, as we'll see in a minute. So policy progress is evident with more comprehensive climate action plans covering buildings and construction in nationally determined contributions. If you don't know what they are, you can follow up elsewhere. Countries committed to Paris, if they signed on to Paris Agreement, they committed to contributing global mitigation through these nationally determined contributions. However, few align with net zero operational emissions, and while over 81 countries have building energy codes, many are outdated. Investment in building decarbonization is growing, and the necessary investment increases are actually falling short of the net zero targets for new and existing buildings by 2030 and 2050 respectively. So if you want to hit 2 degrees C warming target, then you have to hit net zero, let's say by 2050. Building sector has to do its part, so it has to be in a position to reach its full contribution in terms of a trajectory. We should be able to see that by 2030 and so on and so forth. Okay, so there is a global buildings climate tracker, GBCT, which gives us updates, and we will read off some of the things here. To reach the goals of net zero carbon emission buildings for new buildings by 2030 and existing buildings by 2050, stronger policies are needed to enhance energy efficiency and address carbon emissions from building materials and construction. National efforts are crucial, with countries forming coalitions to share best practices and promote low carbon construction. So buildings and construction sector in review is what this report is all about. So there are of course geopolitical tensions and conflicts which add to energy market instability, and also inflation and global interest rate hikes are tampering with growth, affecting developing countries like China, Mexico, Indonesia, India, and so on. There are buildings breakthrough at COP28 aiming for a net zero resilient and inclusive sector, just in terms of global efforts to mitigate this sector's climate impact. Okay, so looking forward to 2024, actually by the time I'm recording this is already October 2024, mid-October 2024. So the focus then must be on tangible emissions reductions, enhancing building performance, increasing renewable energy use, and addressing housing and energy access disparities. Despite the complexities, strategic partnerships can facilitate the shift to an efficient, resilient, and whole life net zero carbon global building stock. Okay, so the topics covered are global buildings and construction status, sustainable buildings and construction policies, global buildings climate tracker GBCT that we just mentioned, buildings climate policy gap review, adaptation and resilient construction methods, innovations in business cases for innovation renovation and green building construction industry. Obviously, old buildings have to be retrofitted to make them also more environmentally friendly, reduce their emissions, take them towards sustainability and so on. Nature-based solutions and biophilic designs are also in play, roadmaps for buildings and constructions, and buildings breakthrough. I'm reading off the subsection titles because it's a long report. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll show some key highlights. So these are the share of buildings in total final energy consumption in 2022 and share of buildings in global energy consumption and process emissions as well. So energy demand by sector, residential, by the building sector, 66% comes from other, 21% from residential, 9% from non-residential, 4% from buildings construction industry. And in terms of emissions by sector, if you look at the transport and other industry, that's 63%. Then you have residential, direct and indirect, non-residential, direct, indirect, buildings construction, and bricks and glass. So it gives you some idea of where the levers may be in terms of reducing emissions. The Global Buildings Carbon Tracker Decarbonization Index looks at where we are and where we are headed. So if we do decarbonization index, we are somewhere here, and it needs to head this way by 2050. So, and the path to the goal is up here in terms of hitting 100% net zero in terms of the building sector, and the gap exists here in 39.8 points. So they have an index that defines all these things. I'm not going to go into that, but you can see that there is a fairly substantial gap in terms of where we are in the last few years and where we need to be if we want to hit the goals by 2030 and 2050. So the GBCT's indicator weights, it's just something they do, and they look at action 63% here for total CO2 emissions, and building sectors energy intensity, renewable share in final energy demand, and so on and so forth. You get the idea that GBCT is tracking net zero and where we are. So let's jump to recommendations for policy and decision makers. Again, not reading the whole thing, but the 2024 Global Status Report for Buildings and Construction indicates a significant lag in the sector's progress towards the Paris Agreement's net zero carbon targets by 2050. To address this, the report provides targeted recommendations. So that is split into for governments, private sector, researchers, and how these steps can help. So for governments, the urgent need is to develop and enforce climate action roadmaps for buildings and construction, with 161 nations still pending. Private sector actors are encouraged to integrate climate action roadmaps, channel investments into energy efficient and net zero carbon buildings, and undertake retrofits to lower emissions, of course, right? How all these things will be incentivized is still tricky. Researchers and NGOs play a crucial role in supporting the creation of climate action roadmaps with evidence-based research. These steps are critical for realigning the buildings and construction sector with the global climate goals, ensuring a sustainable and resilient future. Okay, that's a good kind of a broad guideline for policies, but details will be region specific, local specific, climate specific as well. So some nice images of the efforts at individual building levels on reducing energy use, improving air quality, and taking out CO2 with vegetation. So you can think of rooftop gardens, but also gardens literally on each balcony, and there is a lot of literature on how these are beneficial and so on. They also do social impact assessments in this report. I'm not going to go into the details, but obviously we have Scope 0, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions that we look at, entity and internal practices of the particular part of the sector. So Here examples include ethical leadership, employee health, working conditions and satisfaction, stakeholder engagement, corporate governance, so overlapping with the ESG or the environmental, societal and governance reporting that is needed. Building users and sites under scope 1 with housing attainability, habitability, indoor environmental. So this is social impact work, not emissions. Sorry about that. Climate change impacts and adaptation measures, and of course here you have community and surroundings, supply and value chains, and you have social impact issues and considerations across all scopes. Okay, so these also include diversity and inclusion, health, comfort and safety, privacy and security, and climate impacts. Okay, so building and construction life cycles, operational, design and construction, manufacturing and end of life. So all the scopes have to be covered by the time you're done with the life cycle here. So here is a nice building that is using natural light and airflow to reduce energy use, improve well-being. So these are called biophilic designs, nature-based solutions. Threats to buildings under climate change and available adaptation measures. Of course, you have chronic changes like increasing temperatures and heavy precipitation. Storms, chronic stressors are those, but you have acute stressors like storms, floodings and droughts. And adaptation measures, of course, include renewable energy like and solar shading, increased insulation, solar reflective coating, fabric hardening, PV roof installation, domestic batteries, green facades, rain water tanks, and so on. Scales of water use in the building environment. You have the supply chain use, construction processes use a lot of water, buildings of course themselves will use, and in a setting, cities and communities. So while citizens require direct water for basic needs such as drinking water, cooking and cleaning, our municipal utilities and services also require fresh water. Urban centers often face problems related to insufficient infrastructure, water consumption and loss, wastewater management and water drainage. So water is an important consideration. They suggest principles of water management for the built environment with the inverted pyramid with measures, reduce, reuse and restore water. So understand, measure, understand how much and where the water is being used so that you can manage losses and leakages. And the global ABC, that is the Global Alliance for Building and Construction Roadmap action framework around climate action. So on the inner circle you have zero operational carbon, zero embodied carbon, inclusion and well-being, and adaptation. So embodied carbon of course is that you have emissions happening, but when you produce cement, steel, bricks, etc., and put it together, you have locked in some carbon that is used in manufacturing, that is emitted in manufacturing. So outer layer has strategic priorities, spatial and urban development, new buildings, existing buildings, and construction supply chain. So these are the things you have to worry about in terms of making them compatible with climate action, global warming targets, net zero targets, and so on. There is a roadmap implementation process that is about engaging, assessing, and road mapping so that you can complete the implementation with mobilization, stakeholder engagement, baseline assessments, prioritizations, and timelines, targets, etc. Okay, so I ran through it rather quickly because it is just an addition to what we have discussed in terms of materials, wooden skyscrapers. I also have podcasts on reducing emissions from cement and steel industries and so on. So this is just a complement to that. Building sector as a whole obviously is a big player in overall emissions, and it has to be mainstreamed for sustainability and reducing emissions, and these are the ways to do it. And the global tracker gives status updates that maybe I can report back in a year or two if there are significant updates. Okay, so I will leave this here.